Eyalet Üniversitesi'nden Christopher Gunn'ı konuşmasını yapmak üzere kürsüye davet ediyorum. Mr. Gunn.
Well, good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the ambassador and the embassy and the ATAA for inviting me here to speak today. I'm currently in the final stages of writing and finishing up a dissertation on Armenian terrorism, on modern Armenian terrorism, where it came from, what sustained it, and what has happened to it to the mid-1980s. Over the course of the last year and a half, when I was in Ankara and elsewhere in Turkey, I became close to a former friend, classmate, and colleague, Bahadir Demir. I also met his widow, who was 27 years old at the time of his assassination, on a number of occasions. And so his story has become a bit personal for me. It's more than just a statistic. In fact, instead of us being here today commemorating the 40th anniversary of his death, Bahadir should have celebrated the 50th anniversary of his graduation from Rutgers College this past spring. So again, his story in particular has come to mean something to me. Today, I would like to talk to you about where and how the murders of Mehmet Baydar and Bahadir Demir by Gurgen Yanakin fit into the larger picture of modern Armenian terrorism. Typically, their assassinations on this day in 1973 are treated as merely one of three events in a timeline spread over 10 years that brings us inevitably to the radicalization of the Armenian diaspora, and in particular its youth, in the violent terrorist campaign against the Turkish government, Turkish citizens, Turkish business interests, and eventually anyone that got in its way, which begins officially in 1975. But the first of these three events was the organized worldwide commemorations and anti-Turkish demonstrations that took place in the spring of 1965 to mark the 50th anniversary of the events of 1915. These commemorations are usually attributed with reawakening the dormant and suppressed Armenian nationalism and their grievances against the Turkish government. But the second event is what we're commemorating here today, the assassination of Mr. Baydar and Mr. Demir by Yanakin. The act itself and his challenge to other Armenians to wage war on the representatives of the Turkish government not only served to embolden those in the diaspora who had become frustrated and impatient with political and nonviolent methods, but it also stimulated the resolve of the entire international diaspora. The third and final event took place in the United Nations in the spring of 1974, when a paragraph specifically labeling the events of 1915 as the first case of genocide in the 20th century was deleted from a report on the prevention of genocide that was submitted to the UN Commission on Human Rights. This was a paragraph that many Armenians had spent months advocating and lobbying for. And so, the story goes, and this is the traditional narrative of Armenian terrorism, the extreme frustration that this deletion caused within the Armenian community, the rising assertiveness of the Armenian diaspora since 1965, and the relatively well-publicized murders of 1973, all came together at some point in late 1974 to produce Armenian terrorism. Now, I've been working on this topic for close to 3 years now, and I can tell you that there are a number of things wrong with this narrative, how it is told and discussed today. Too many problems, in fact, to cover in 15 minutes. But it is certainly true that the Armenian question reappears from out of nowhere in early 1965. The demonstrations on April 24th in Beirut drew about 85,000 people, and close to 100,000 participated in Yerevan. In Armenia, these demonstrations led to Soviet permission to hold annual public commemorations of April 24th and to construct a memorial to the victims in territories lost to Turkey in 1915. Here in the United States, there were large demonstrations in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles. And the major news organizations provided substantial coverage to the Armenian question for the first time in decades. The New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. Although they would attract less and less national attention in the following years, these protest demonstrations by Armenian Americans continued and became increasingly more aggressive and anti-Turkish in nature. In April 1971, for example, 2,000 Armenians protested outside of the Turkish consulate in Los Angeles. In April of 1972, they actually managed to break into the building and present the Consul General with a list of demands. And in November of 1972, 2 months before the murders, 50 Armenians were arrested after they disrupted a function sponsored by the Turkish American Society in a Beverly Hills hotel. They broke in and were harassing the guests. Book and pamphlet publishing also increased. In the decade prior to 1965, 15 items were published or republished in English on the Armenian question. In 1965 alone, 25 were published. By the end of 1972, that figure had reached close to 70, and those numbers do not include continual republication, reissuing of Ambassador Morgenthau's story, and the 40 Days of Musadab. There was also a marked increase in the attention being paid to the events of 1915 in the U.S. Congress. Although it had rarely been mentioned during the 1950s, the coverage in the spring of 1965 was extensive. Over 22 instances between April 4th and May 6th, and it involved over 40 U.S. congressmen. And finally, in addition to these demonstrations, publications, and congressional speeches, in 1967, the Armenian Americans in California successfully obtained permission to build their monument in Montebello, monument to the Armenian martyrs of 1915. But even considering the prevailing atmosphere and environment, especially in California, this does not explain why Gergen Yanikin sought justice by murdering 2 innocent men. Nor does it explain, by extension, why more murders would follow. There is a much deeper and darker side to this reawakening of Armenian nationalism and the reemergence of the Armenian question that is often overlooked. And I would argue that the deaths of Mr. Baydar and Mr. Demir were not only or merely the first 2 of 31 Turkish diplomats who would be assassinated by the Armenian diaspora, but also a link between 11 murders in the early 1920s and the 29 in the late 1970s and 1980s that illustrate a sustained culture of violence within the Armenian diaspora that has glorified and venerated individuals who carry out attacks on ethnic Turks. And this is clearly evident in the years leading up to the Yanikian murders and the assassinations in Vienna and Paris in October of 1975. This cult of violence has 2 facets. The first is simply the honoring of any Armenian who avenges the Armenian nation by murdering a Turk. And the second is the practice of dehumanizing the Turkish people through either racial or religious hate speech and holding all Turks, past, present, and future, collectively and individually responsible for the events of 1915. The second facet I'm sure you're all familiar with, the constant repetition of the language and terms used in the 19th century, Gladstonian language, barbarians, savages, rapists, etc. And also the attributing of all the positive aspects of the Ottoman Empire to the Christian subjects, the Greeks, the Armenians, etc. But that many of the Armenian publications in this period also endeavored to prove the guilt and responsibility of all Turks It may not be as well known, but it certainly would not surprise. But it's this first aspect, the practice of honoring and venerating violence within the diaspora, which is less well known, but extremely important in explaining both the Anikian murders and the many more that would follow. To analyze this in a little more detail, we have to go back to the end of World War I. Between March 1921 and April of 1922, Armenians operating in Europe and the Caucasus assassinated Talat Pasha, Jamal Pasha, and a number of other Ottoman officials. I'm sure you're familiar with this story. Known as Nemesis, this operation was orchestrated by members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation based out of Boston, here in the United States. And it operated for 13 months and killed 10 individuals. 7 Turks, 1 Azeri, and at least 2 Armenians that had been marked as traitors. The most famous of the Nemesis agents was Salomon Talerian, the young man who shot and killed Talat Pasha in broad daylight on a busy street in Berlin, and who would later be found not guilty by the German jury who heard his case. The key to his acquittal was in convincing the jury that he was so